Hey guys, welcome back. Or if you're new here, welcome in. Tonight, we're taking a slow float back in time, a few thousand years, to a place where sand stretches into forever. The air is dry, and giant stone triangles just casually sit around, pretending they're not the most mysterious buildings on Earth. Yes, the pyramids of Egypt. So dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and don't worry. I'm not about to launch into some Discovery Channel dramatics. No alien theories, no booming soundtrack, just us, calmly talking about rocks that have been standing around longer than most civilizations have even existed. Because apparently, the Egyptians were the type of overachievers who saw a pile of limestone and thought, yeah, let's drag this up a ramp for 30 years straight. Now, let's set the scene. Ancient Egypt, around 2600 BCE. Pharaohs are basically gods on Earth, and everyone else is, well, everyone else. Life expectancy was maybe 35 if you were lucky, unless you were a pharaoh. In which case, you might make it to your 50s, mostly out of spite. The Nile is doing its thing, flooding and retreating like a temperamental roommate, but still providing the crops that let Egypt thrive. And in the middle of this, they decide to build pyramids. The first real pyramid, by the way, wasn't even a proper pyramid. It was a kind of step pyramid built for King Joseph around 2650 BCE. Picture a wedding cake, but made of stone, and absolutely no fun to eat. His architect, Imhotep, yes, like in the Mummy movies, thought, let's stack some giant rectangles and see what happens. It worked. People were impressed. Suddenly, stacking rocks wasn't just functional, it was fashionable. But of course, you can't just stop with one. Oh no. Once you've got the biggest, weirdest grave in the region, every pharaoh after you wants to one-up it. Because what is history, if not one long string of insecure men competing over who can build the flashiest tomb? So then we get to Sneferu, the man who basically became the Elon Musk of pyramid building, minus the tweets. Sneferu tried multiple times, because apparently one pyramid wasn't enough. His first attempt, the so-called collapsed pyramid at Meidum, was, well, a mess. The outer layers literally slid off, leaving what looks today like a giant square block sitting awkwardly in the desert. It's the architectural equivalent of baking a cake, watching it collapse, and then still serving it anyway. But did Sneferu give up? Of course not. He doubled down, because why not throw more labor and limestone at the problem? His next pyramid attempt is what we now call the bent pyramid. And yes, it's bent because halfway through construction, the builders realized the angle was too steep and the whole thing might cave in. So they just changed the slope midway. Imagine building a skyscraper and halfway up, deciding, hey, let's tilt it a little. Bold choice, Sneferu, bold choice. Finally, after 2 practice runs, he nailed it. The Red Pyramid at Dashur, smooth sides, proper angles, big, imposing, the first real pyramid as we imagine them. So technically, Sneferu built 3 pyramids, 2 of which were disasters. But hey, 3rd time's the charm. Now, here's the thing. These pyramids weren't just graves. They were cosmic PR campaigns. Pharaohs didn't just want to die. They wanted to ascend to the afterlife in style, complete with furniture, jewelry, food, servants, sometimes even actual servants, though let's not linger on that cheerful little fact. The pyramid was basically the launch pad for their soul. If you believe the texts, it connected them to the sun god Ra, helping them rise up into the sky. The triangle shape itself, symbolic of the sun's rays. which sounds poetic until you realize that the symbolism meant dragging multi-ton blocks of limestone into place for decades. Speaking of blocks, let's talk logistics, because this is where the mystery really takes over. Each block could weigh anywhere from 2 to 15 tons, and the Great Pyramid, about 2.3 million blocks in total, which raises the cozy bedtime question. How exactly do you move a mountain one piece at a time without bulldozers, cranes, or even wheels strong enough to hold the weight? The classic theory is ramps. Just ramps everywhere. Straight ramps, zigzag ramps, spiral ramps. Egyptologists love ramps the way modern people love IKEA instructions. Even if they don't always make sense, you cling to them, because what else are you gonna do? The problem is, if you build a ramp long enough to drag blocks all the way to the top of the Great Pyramid, the ramp itself would be longer than the pyramid. So essentially, you'd have to build another pyramid just to build a pyramid, which feels inefficient. Other theories involve levers, pulleys, counterweights, or pouring water on sand to make it slippery, which actually works, by the way. Experiments show wet sand reduces friction by like half, which makes me picture lines of workers with buckets, just casually dampening the desert, turning pyramid building into the world's most boring beach day. Now, speaking of workers, let's clear up a big myth. No, they weren't slaves. At least, not in the Hollywood chained and whipped sense. Evidence shows they were more like conscripted laborers, peasants drafted during the Nile's flood season when their fields were underwater and they had nothing better to do. Free food, beer, and shelter were provided, which, let's be honest, is more than most modern internships. They lived in nearby worker villages, some even buried respectfully when they died. So yeah, pyramid building was miserable, back-breaking work. But at least it came with benefits. Now, let's glide gently over to the big star of the show, the Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE. Originally, it stood about 146 meters tall, taller than any building on Earth for almost 4,000 years, covered in gleaming white limestone casing stones that reflected the sun like a mirror. Imagine being a farmer in the Nile Valley, squinting at this blinding triangle in the distance, thinking, yep, that's where all my taxes went. Khufu himself has a bit of a reputation. Ancient writers like Herodotus painted him as a cruel tyrant, forcing thousands into endless labor. But honestly, Herodotus was writing like 2,000 years after the fact, so his gossip game might not be the most reliable. Other sources suggest Khufu was fine, just another pharaoh obsessed with legacy. Either way, the man clearly knew how to get his point across, because 4,500 years later, we're still talking about him. Inside the Great Pyramid, things get even weirder. Narrow shafts, hidden chambers, passageways that go nowhere. The king's chamber sits in the middle, lined with massive granite blocks dragged all the way from Aswan, hundreds of miles away. Above it, a series of relieving chambers with more giant stones stacked to prevent the ceiling from caving in, which makes sense, but also feels like architectural overkill. And then there are the so-called air shafts that don't really lead outside, but instead point towards specific stars, which raises the question, were they vents, or were they cosmic Wi-Fi for the pharaoh's soul? Of course, because humans love a good conspiracy, the pyramids have become ground zero for theories, aliens, lost civilizations, advanced ancient technology. Personally, I think if aliens had the technology to cross galaxies, they probably built something more useful than a giant triangle that doubles as a tourist attraction. But sure, let's credit extraterrestrials instead of 100,000 sweaty Egyptians with ropes and patience. But the truth is, the real mystery isn't how they were built. It's why they were abandoned. Because after a few generations of pyramid mania, Egypt just stopped. Later, pharaohs went back to smaller, less flashy tombs, like the rock-cut chambers in the Valley of the Kings. Turns out, making your tomb into the biggest landmark on Earth is basically an open invitation for grave robbers. And spoiler alert, every single pyramid was looted. Gold, treasures, everything, gone. Even Khufu's body, missing. Man built a wonder of the world, and he still couldn't keep his stuff. So in the end, pyramids weren't eternal vaults. They were giant, expensive billboards saying, "Please rob me." And yet, despite the failures, they remain standing. Not because of mystery, but because of sheer stubborn durability. Limestone doesn't care if you've got Wi-Fi or not. It just sits there. And somehow, that feels fitting. Alright, let's drift for now. In the next part, we'll float further into the odd little details. The pyramids that failed spectacularly, the weird pharaoh personalities behind them, and how ancient construction projects always seemed one bad decision away from disaster. So, we left off with the Great Pyramid standing tall, blinding the desert in its white limestone glory, and Khufu sitting smugly in his afterlife, or at least trying to, before looters helped themselves to his grave goods. But Khufu wasn't the only pharaoh who thought bigger is better. Oh no. Egypt had a whole dynasty of pyramid fanboys, each one eager to prove they had the biggest triangle in town. Let's drift back to Snefru for a moment, because honestly, this man deserves more attention. Picture him as the over-enthusiastic grandpa of pyramid building. He just couldn't stop tinkering. First, he had the collapsed pyramid, which basically face-planted. Then the bent pyramid, which looks like the builders just gave up halfway and said, "Hey, good enough." Finally, he managed the red pyramid, which turned out all right. 3 pyramids, all in one lifetime, which is basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of buying 3 sports cars because the first 2 kept breaking down. And remember, each one of these projects took decades, massive manpower, and ungodly amounts of resources. Snefru wasn't just building tombs. He was burning through Egypt's GDP for bragging rights in the afterlife. You almost admire the pettiness. His son, Khufu, inherited that same energy, but cranked it up to 11. The Great Pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement. My dad built 3 pyramids? Cute. I'm going to build one so big people will still be staring at it in the year 2025. And, well, mission accomplished. Now, the funny thing about Khufu is that we actually know almost nothing about him, which is awkward considering he left behind the biggest monument in human history. You'd think someone would have written a diary, or at least carved "Khufu was here" on a wall. But no, almost all we know comes from later historians who weren't even alive when he ruled. Herodotus, for instance, painted Khufu as some sort of cruel tyrant who closed temples, enslaved the population, and pimped out his own daughter to fund pyramid construction. Which sounds dramatic, but also suspiciously like ancient gossip. Scholars today suspect he was probably just another standard issue pharaoh, arrogant, divine in his own mind, and obsessed with eternity. The real legacy of Khufu isn't in stories though, it's in the pyramid itself. And what's ironic is that while the monument lasted, the man didn't. His mummy is missing, his treasures are gone, and all we have is a giant stone triangle and some graffiti from workers inside, saying things like "Friends of Khufu" and "The Drunkards of Menkore," which honestly might be the most relatable thing about the whole project. Speaking of Menkore, let's float to him. He was Khufu's grandson, and he built the smallest of the 3 pyramids at Giza, which already sounds embarrassing, right? Like showing up to the family reunion with a compact car while your dad and granddad are revving sports cars. But Menkore actually leaned into it. His pyramid is smaller, yes, but he tried to make it more luxurious, covering it in granite instead of just limestone. It's the ancient version of saying, sure, my house is smaller, but at least it has granite countertops. Menkore also had a reputation for being nicer than his predecessors. Ancient sources say he was kind, fair, and actually listened to people, which of course meant he died young. Because history loves irony, his pyramid ended up unfinished, completed in a rush by his queen. So while Khufu gets the Great Pyramid and endless speculation, Menkore is remembered as the guy with the smaller, slightly fancier one. Sometimes history is crueler than any pharaoh. But let's not skip over Khafre, Khufu's son, the middle act in the Giza trilogy. Khafre built the 2nd pyramid, which is technically shorter than the Great Pyramid, but because he plopped it on higher ground, it looks taller, which is just chef's kiss petty. It's the architectural version of standing on tiptoes in a family photo. Khafre also gets credit for the Great Sphinx, that giant half-lion, half-pharaoh statue, glaring at tourists to this day. Scholars still argue over whether it really represents Khafre. But let's be real. Who else would build a giant self-portrait with a cat body? Khafre's reign is remembered as one of prosperity and stability, which is historian speak for not much drama happened, so we don't have fun stories. But hey, his pyramid's still standing, his sphinx is still glaring, and that's more than most rulers can claim. Now, all this pyramid building wasn't just about vanity. It was also about religious legitimacy. Each pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was supposedly the literal son of the sun god Ra. Building a pyramid wasn't just making a tomb. It was proving your divine connection. And since religion in Egypt was basically politics, a bigger pyramid meant a bigger claim to the throne. It's like campaign posters, but made of stone and visible from miles away. But let's pause on the workers again, because their lives give us the most grounded picture of this whole ordeal. Excavations at Giza have uncovered entire worker villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, and dorm-style housing, which means pyramid construction sites were basically ancient company towns. Workers were fed a diet heavy on bread, onions, and beer. And by beer, I don't mean a refreshing cold pint. It was more like a thick, soupy porridge with alcohol. Imagine drinking 3 bowls of lukewarm oat beer and then dragging a 2-ton stone across the desert. Skeletal remains show they suffered from arthritis, broken bones, and wear and tear you'd expect from hauling rocks your entire life. But interestingly, many of those bones show signs of medical treatment. Splints, healed fractures, evidence of care, which suggests these people weren't just disposable. They were looked after, at least to some degree, which makes sense. You can't exactly replace skilled masons and engineers overnight. And yet, even with thousands of workers and decades of effort, pyramid construction was a logistical nightmare. One wrong angle, and the whole thing could collapse, as Sneferu's bent pyramid showed us, which makes it all the more impressive that the Great Pyramid is aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. off by less than a fraction of a degree. Somehow, with no GPS, no lasers, and no YouTube tutorials, they managed precision we still struggle with today. Of course, that precision is what keeps the conspiracy theories alive. How could they do this without modern technology? Well, the answer is patience, manpower, and a whole lot of trial and error. Remember, the Egyptians had centuries of practice. The pyramids didn't just appear out of nowhere. They evolved from mastabas, those rectangular flat tombs, to step pyramids, to bent pyramids, to the smooth-sided giants we know today. It wasn't magic. It was stubbornness, perfected over generations. And speaking of stubbornness, let's drift for a moment into the mindset of these pharaohs. Imagine knowing that your entire reign will be judged not by your policies, not by your wars, not even by your family drama, but by how impressive your tomb looks. That was the ancient Egyptian deal. Your afterlife depended on it, but so did your reputation. A failed pyramid wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic for your divine PR. Sneferu's flops, still remembered. Menkaur's small size, still joked about. Khufu's grand success, immortal. And honestly, it makes you wonder how much of human history is just ego-driven construction projects. Pyramids, palaces, skyscrapers, all of them basically saying, "Don't forget me." Alright, let's gently wrap this part here. We've met the big pyramid builders, Sneferu, the tinkerer, Khufu, the egotist, Khafra, the tiptoe artist, and Menkaur, the modest but classy one. In the next part, we'll float over to the stranger mysteries, the hidden chambers, the curses, the failed pyramid experiments that look more like abstract art than tombs, and why the whole pyramid craze eventually fizzled out. Alright, so we've admired the successes. The Great Pyramid still towering, Khafra's Sphinx still looking annoyed, Menkaur's granite countertop pyramid still respectable. But for every triumph of ancient engineering, there were, well, flops. And honestly, the failures are often more fun to talk about. Let's go back for a moment to Sneferu, our favorite pyramid hobbyist. We already mentioned his first attempt, the collapsed pyramid at Meidum. And if you haven't seen pictures, imagine a child building a sandcastle, then stomping on it halfway through. That's Meidum. Archaeologists aren't even sure if it collapsed during construction or sometime later. But either way, it wasn't exactly confidence-inspiring. Sneferu's subjects probably walked past it and thought, "Wow, glad we risked our spines dragging stones for that." Then we have the bent pyramid, which, in its defense, is still standing. But you can't exactly call it elegant. It starts at a steep angle, then halfway up, suddenly flattens out, like the builders got tired and said, "Yeah, let's just phone it in from here." Modern engineers think they realized mid-project that the angle would cause structural collapse, so they improvised. Honestly, respect for the pivot. But still, if you're a pharaoh banking your eternal soul on geometry, a lopsided tomb probably wasn't the aesthetic you had in mind. Later, pharaohs kept making bold choices that didn't always work. There's the Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III, which collapsed into rubble because someone thought clay and mud brick were a good substitute for stone. Spoiler, they weren't. There's also the Pyramid of Djedefre, Khufu's son, which barely got started before being abandoned, leaving just a sad pile of stones. Honestly, Egypt is littered with these half-finished, half-failed pyramids, like a graveyard of architectural drafts. But of course, failures don't get the same spotlight as the big three at Giza. The Great Pyramid is the Beyoncé of tombs, while the collapsed pyramid is that awkward cousin who quit halfway through college. Still, the failures remind us that pyramid building wasn't a smooth science. It was a centuries-long process of trial, error, and sheer stubbornness. Now, let's float inside these pyramids for a bit, because the interiors are where things get truly strange. Narrow passageways that make no sense, chambers stacked above chambers, shafts that lead nowhere. Sometimes it feels less like a tomb and more like an ancient escape room. Without the escape, the Great Pyramid, for instance, has 3 main rooms: the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and the Subterranean Chamber. The King's Chamber is the big one, with its massive granite blocks and an empty sarcophagus that, surprise, never held a body. The Queen's Chamber, smaller, undecorated, and misleadingly named because no queen was ever buried there. And the Subterranean Chamber, a rough, unfinished room cut into the bedrock that looks like the builders got bored and wandered off. Then there are the shafts. In the Queen's Chamber, 2 narrow shafts snake upward, blocked by mysterious stone doors with copper handles. For decades, nobody knew what they were for. Ventilation, symbolic star alignments, a pharaoh-sized hamster tunnel. In the 1990s, robots were sent up these shafts, only to find blocked passages leading to more blocked passages. Because apparently, the ancient Egyptians loved trolling us. And even today, with ground-penetrating radar and fancy tech, we're still finding hidden voids inside the Great Pyramid. In 2017, scientists announced they detected a massive empty space above the Grand Gallery, about the size of a passenger plane. What's in it? No one knows. Could be another chamber, could be a construction cavity, could be nothing. Which means the Great Pyramid is basically history's biggest unopened mystery box. And honestly, maybe that's the point. But here's the fun part. Despite all this mystery, the pyramids themselves were never actually effective tombs. Remember how I said they were all robbed? Yeah, every single one. Grave robbers had thousands of years to work with, and apparently they were very efficient. Treasure? Gone. Gold? Gone. Mummies? Missing. Pharaohs spent their lives bankrupting the state to build an eternal resting place, only for future looters to walk in, grab the goods, and leave nothing but dust, which makes the whole enterprise feel a little tragic. And yet, despite being robbed blind, the pyramids picked up another legacy: curses. Ah yes, the famous Pharaoh's Curse, beloved by horror movies and travel guides alike. Let's clear this up. No, there's no actual ancient Egyptian text saying, "Whoever disturbs my tomb shall be cursed." That's Victorian fiction at its finest. But like all good myths, it's stuck. The most famous example isn't even about a pyramid. It's about Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered in 1922. When Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's sponsor, died shortly after from an infected mosquito bite, newspapers went wild. "Curse of the Pharaoh strikes again," they screamed, conveniently ignoring the fact that dozens of other people on the dig lived long, uneventful lives. But hey, mosquito wins, doesn't sell papers. Still, the idea of cursed tombs has staying power. Probably because pyramids look like the kind of places you'd expect curses to live. Dark tunnels, sealed chambers, cryptic hieroglyphs. Add in a few bats and you've got the perfect Gothic vibe. Never mind that the reality was less death curse and more looters with chisels. But to be fair, there is a grain of truth. Ancient tombs, often contained old food offerings, decomposing materials, and yes, mold and bacteria. Breaking into a sealed chamber after thousands of years could expose you to some nasty stuff. Not magical death rays, just bad air quality, which is somehow less fun to tell around a campfire. Now, let's drift back out to the bigger picture. Why did pyramid building eventually stop? After the Giza pyramids, later pharaohs kept experimenting, but the projects got smaller, cheaper, and frankly, less impressive. By the Middle Kingdom, pyramids were mostly mud brick, and most of those crumbled away. By the New Kingdom, rulers switched entirely to hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Why the shift? Well, lesson learned. Giant stone triangles make great landmarks, but they also scream, dig here for treasure. Pharaohs realized that subtlety was safer. The Valley of the Kings is full of rock-cut tombs buried deep in cliffs, designed to hide, not flaunt. Spoiler, those were robbed too, but at least it took longer. And honestly, by then, Egyptian religion had evolved. Pharaohs were still divine, but the emphasis shifted more toward rituals, temples, elaborate funerary texts like the Book of the Dead. Pyramids, with their showy geometry, felt outdated, like someone still showing up to parties in a powdered wig. So the Pyramid Age came and went. But what a legacy it left. Today, the symbols of Egypt itself, tourist magnets, national icons, and for us, late-night story fuel. All right, let's let that thought settle. In the next part, we'll drift into the stranger human side, the everyday workers who built these things, the weird little details about their diets and injuries, and the small, almost cozy stories that make the pyramids feel less like alien mysteries and more like the result of very human effort, sweat, bread, beer, and probably a lot of complaining. So, when you picture pyramid construction, chances are the mental image is something like a Hollywood set. Endless rows of slaves in chains, whipped by overseers, sweating under the desert sun while dramatic music plays in the background. Very Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. And, yeah, that's wrong. Archaeology has done us the favor of crushing that cinematic fantasy. Because the actual pyramid builders, they weren't slaves, not in the chattel sense. They were Egyptians themselves, ordinary farmers, artisans, and laborers drafted for national service. And while their lives weren't exactly comfortable spa retreats, they weren't pure misery either. In fact, the story of the workers is one of the most quietly fascinating parts of pyramid history. Let's set the scene. Imagine the Nile flooding every year, farmlands underwater, farmers sitting around, crops impossible to tend. What's a pharaoh to do with all this idle manpower? Easy. Put them to work on giant construction projects. Think of it as a state-run job program. Except instead of building roads or schools, they were hauling 2-ton limestone blocks up ramps. At least it kept unemployment at zero. Excavations at Giza have uncovered entire worker villages, neat little rows of mud brick houses, bakeries with bread ovens still intact, breweries with vats for fermenting beer, even medical facilities where injured workers were treated. So instead of a chaotic slave camp, we get the picture of an organized, surprisingly well-fed labor force. And let's talk about that diet. Bread and beer were the staples, not fluffy baguettes or craft ales. More like dense loaves of barley bread and a thick soupy beer that was halfway between oatmeal and weak ale. Basically, liquid carbs. Perfect for heavy labor. Archaeologists estimate pyramid workers consumed thousands of calories a day. Some say up to 4,000. They also got meat like beef and goat, more than the average Egyptian. would ever dream of. So yes, building pyramids destroyed your joints, but at least you got steak and beer out of it. Their skeletons tell us more. Many show signs of arthritis, spinal damage, and broken bones, which, given the job, is no shocker. But here's the interesting part. Those broken bones often healed, meaning they were treated and cared for, not just tossed aside. Evidence of splints, even early surgery in some cases, shows the Egyptians actually invested in their workers' well-being. After all, a skilled stone hauler was valuable. You don't waste good talent in a workforce of thousands. And then there's the graffiti. Yes, even 4,500 years ago, people loved scribbling jokes on walls. Inside the Great Pyramid, some of the blocks have markings left by work crews. Team names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkora, which immediately humanizes the whole thing. Imagine being covered in limestone dust all day, then carving your crew's name on a block like it's a bathroom stall. The Friends of Khufu were here. History's first construction site banter. We also find evidence of worker strikes. That's right, pyramid builders went on strike. Later in Egyptian history, during the construction of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, workers stopped showing up because their rations weren't delivered. Which makes sense. If you're promised beer and bread and the pharaoh suddenly skimps, you don't drag any more rocks until that beer shows up. History's first recorded labor protests. And they worked. Officials quickly scrambled to feed the workers again. Even in the ancient world, the squeaky wheel got the grease. Or in this case, the barley beer. So no, the pyramids weren't built by chains of miserable slaves. They were built by Egyptians with sore backs, steady rations, and probably a lot of grumbling. Which feels, in its own way, more impressive. It wasn't cruelty that raised those stones. It was organization. Now let's think about logistics again. But from the worker's point of view, waking up at dawn, eating bread that probably tasted like cardboard, heading out in gangs of 20, ropes slung over your shoulders, dragging a block through the sand. Maybe some overseer shouting at you, but mostly just sweat and repetition. Hour after hour, day after day. At night, collapsing into your mud brick hut, washing dust off in a basin. Maybe joking with your crewmates about who nearly got crushed that day. And then doing it again tomorrow. Multiply that by decades and voila, a pyramid. And yet, even with all the monotony, there must have been a strange sense of pride. You're part of something colossal, something sacred. Pharaohs weren't just kings, they were divine. Working on their tomb wasn't just the paycheck, it was religious duty. You weren't just hauling rocks, you were building eternity. And maybe that thought helped numb the pain in your back. Or maybe it didn't, and you just kept chewing on stale bread, wishing you'd become a fisherman instead. But here's the bittersweet part. These workers remain mostly anonymous. No personal names, no life stories, except for the rare graffiti scribbles. Their bones and tools are all we have. The pharaohs hog the glory, their names etched into history, while the real builders sleep in modest graves by the desert. And yet, without them, none of this would exist. The pyramids may be monuments to kings, but they're really monuments to labor. Now, there's one more interesting layer. The workers weren't alone. Specialists, engineers, architects, these people coordinated the madness. You needed surveyors to align the base, quarrymen to cut the stone, haulers to drag it, masons to shape it, overseers to manage crews, and above them, priests and administrators, keeping everything tied to religious calendars and royal decrees. It wasn't chaos. It was bureaucracy at its finest. Ancient Egypt, where even hauling rocks required paperwork. And speaking of paperwork, the Egyptians loved recording things. We found fragments of papyrus with delivery schedules, ration lists, and notes about how many workers were assigned to which tasks. Imagine a clipboard-wielding foreman checking boxes while 50 guys struggle with a granite block. The efficiency is almost modern. So yes, the pyramids weren't magic. They were logistics, organization on a massive scale. Thousands of ordinary people, thousands of ordinary days, stacked one on top of another until they made stone mountains, which, in its own quiet way, is more awe-inspiring than any alien theory. Now, as we drift toward the end of this part, let's circle back to the image of those workers. Anonymous men, some women too, cooking bread, brewing beer, hauling, chiseling, sweating, and joking about pharaohs behind their backs. Their fingerprints are still on the stones. Their laughter, their curses, their exhaustion, all hidden inside the silent geometry of the pyramids. We'll never know their names, but in a way, they achieved immortality too. Every tourist snapping a photo at Giza owes them a quiet nod. Alright, let's let that picture rest. In the next part, we'll float toward the twilight of pyramid building. How Egypt slowly gave up on giant tombs, turned instead to hidden valleys and scrolls of spells, and how the pyramid craze went from unstoppable to outdated, because even eternal monuments eventually go out of fashion. Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to ancient Rome. So dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket and get comfortable, because we're about to talk about gladiators, the men who fought in sand-covered arenas while thousands cheered, and who, when you actually look closer, lived some of the strangest, saddest, and occasionally ridiculous lives in history. Now, I know what you're picturing. Russell Crowe in Gladiator, standing tall, yelling about vengeance, spearing tigers, and catching the Emperor's eye. Hollywood gave us a very specific image. Noble warriors, forced to fight, tragically heroic, and somehow always looking good, in leather straps. Reality, less epic, more awkward, a lot sweatier, and much more bureaucratic than anyone would like to admit. Let's start with the basics. Gladiators were, in fact, a mix. Yes, some were slaves, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or just people unlucky enough to get caught up in Rome's justice system. But, and this always surprises people, some gladiators were volunteers, free men, people who willingly signed a contract saying, "Yes, please, I'd love to be beaten half to death in front of a screaming crowd. Where do I sign? Why would anyone do that? Well, a few reasons. Money for one, fame for another, and sometimes because they were just bored. Romans were dramatic people. They loved spectacle. If you were poor and saw no other way to climb the social ladder, why not try fighting in the arena? At least the food was decent, the training was strict, and you got a guaranteed bed in the gladiator barracks. Compared to starving on the streets of Rome, swinging a sword in a sandpit might actually seem like an upgrade. And yes, they did have barracks, training schools called ludi. These were run by managers, or lanista, who were basically talent agents for human weapons. Lanista owned the gladiators, rented them out for shows, and made money off their fights. So imagine a cross between a fight promoter, a prison warden, and a modern sports manager, but with fewer rules and way more bloodstains. Life in the ludus, the gladiator school, was strict. Gladiators weren't just tossed into the arena with a sword and told, "Good luck." They trained for months, sometimes years, under the watch of professional instructors. These instructors were often retired gladiators themselves, the grizzled veterans who knew how to survive, or at least knew how to make dying look entertaining. Training was constant. Wooden swords first, then real weapons. Drills, drills, and more drills. Because the arena wasn't just about killing your opponent. It was about putting on a show. That's another myth to clear up right away. Not every gladiator fight ended in death. Sure, some did, but most. The majority were carefully managed performances. The organizers spent money training and housing these fighters. Killing them off every match would be like throwing away investments. So more often than not, fights ended when one man was clearly defeated, injured, exhausted, or disarmed. At that point, the referee, yes, there were referees, would stop the match and wait for the sponsor's decision. And here's where the famous thumbs up, thumbs down moment comes in. Except history is annoyingly unclear on what gesture meant what. Some sources say thumbs up meant death, others say it meant mercy. Either way, the crowd got involved, chanting for blood or mercy. And the sponsor, usually some rich politician looking to buy votes through free entertainment, would decide the loser's fate. But again, mercy was common, because dead gladiators don't bring ticket sales next week, and Romans were obsessed with continuity. They wanted to follow favorite fighters like we follow sports teams today. Imagine cheering for your favorite Retiarius, that's the guy with the net and trident, and watching him narrowly escape defeat. The suspense wasn't in whether someone would die. It was in how well they fought, how skillfully, how dramatically. The arena was theatre as much as combat. Of course, this doesn't mean life was safe. Far from it. Gladiators suffered injuries constantly. Broken bones, deep cuts, infections. Medicine was primitive. And gladiator doctors had one main job: patch you up well enough to fight again. You weren't a patient. You were an investment. And yet, despite all this, gladiators became celebrities. Some were adored like rock stars. Women, in particular, were fascinated by them. Roman poets complained constantly about respectable wives swooning over sweaty gladiators. One poet sneered that even the wealthy lady in her jewels and perfumes couldn't resist a man with scars and muscles from the arena. Which, let's be honest, is a little bitter. Clearly, some poet had competition. There were even female gladiators, though rare. Called gladiatresses, they fought in the arena too, usually as a novelty act, something to spice up the games. Roman writers thought it was scandalous, unnatural, and endlessly entertaining. Which means, of course, they probably drew big crowds. Now, let's glide over to the economics of all this. Gladiator games weren't just casual weekend fun. They were political tools. Hosting games was expensive. You had to pay for the arena, the staff, the musicians, the referees, the exotic animals, and of course the gladiators. So why bother? Because games brought popularity. A wealthy Roman aiming for office could win votes by throwing lavish spectacles. Bread and circuses, as the famous phrase goes. Feed the people, entertain them, and they'll ignore the corruption. Sound familiar? Yes, it's basically the Roman version of campaign ads, except with lions. And here's another ironic twist. While gladiators were adored in the arena, they were still legally at the bottom of society. Even free men who volunteered to become gladiators lost their legal rights. They were branded as infames, people of disgrace, same category as actors and prostitutes. So you could be cheered by 50,000 fans on Saturday and then refused service at a tavern on Sunday. Fame didn't erase stigma, it just made it more awkward. And yet, some gladiators actually won their freedom. After years of service, or a particularly impressive career, a gladiator might be awarded a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing retirement. Once you had the rudis, you were free. Some men went back to normal life. Others became trainers. A few, the ambitious ones, even chose to keep fighting as free men, soaking up the fame and the paycheck until their luck finally ran out. Alright, let's slow down here and take a breath, because the world of gladiators was messy. It wasn't just constant bloodshed, nor was it noble heroism. It was somewhere in between. Part sport, part theatre, part political stunt, part very real danger. A system that chewed people up for entertainment, but also gave them strange forms of fame, fortune, and even, occasionally, respect. And as we drift deeper into this story, we'll move beyond the big picture and start sinking into the lives of specific gladiators, the famous ones, the unlucky ones, the ones whose names slipped through the cracks of history, but whose scars tell us plenty. Because if the Colosseum was Rome's stage, then gladiators were its most tragic actors, performing not just for survival, but for spectacle. So stay comfortable. In the next part, we'll float into the world of the ludus, the training schools, and look more closely at the daily lives of gladiators, their food, their beds, their drills, their punishments, and the small, strange details that made up existence in the shadow of the arena. Spoiler, it involved a lot of beans. So, picture Rome's Colosseum for a moment. The crowds, the sand, the roar. Now take all of that away. The cheering, the lions, the politicians waving from their seats. Strip it down. What you're left with, most of the time, was the training school, the ludus, the place where gladiators actually spent the majority of their lives. And here's the thing, the ludus was basically half prison, half sports academy, which sounds like an odd combination, but Rome thrived on contradictions. On one hand, men inside were valuable athletes. On the other, there were still slaves, criminals, or desperate volunteers who had signed away their rights. So daily life was a weird mix of strict discipline and careful protection. Let's start with food. Because if there's one stereotype that's completely true, it's that gladiators ate beans. Lots of beans. In fact, ancient writers nicknamed them porderi, barley men. Their diet was heavy on grains, beans, and porridge. Why? Because carbs build mass. Protein builds muscle, yes, but bulk. That comes from carbs. Gladiators needed to be thick, heavy, with a layer of body fat to protect them from shallow cuts. Imagine modern strongmen, but with more lentils and fewer protein shakes. Archaeology backs this up. Bone analysis from gladiator cemeteries shows high levels of calcium and signs of plant-heavy diets. Researchers even found that gladiators drank a tonic made from charred bones and vinegar, which sounds disgusting, but apparently worked as a kind of ancient Gatorade, boosting recovery and bone strength. So if you've ever complained about your kale smoothie, just remember, at least it's not vinegar mixed with burnt skeleton bits. Now, training. This wasn't chaotic brawling. It was meticulous. Gladiators were drilled endlessly with wooden swords, which were deliberately heavier than real weapons. The idea was that if you could swing a weighted wooden sword for hours without collapsing, then a real blade would feel light as a feather in the arena. Kind of like modern athletes training with weighted bats or resistance bands, except instead of game day, you faced a guy with a trident who wanted to stab you. The drills were relentless. Strike, block, sidestep, over and over. Each gladiator specialized in a particular style. The retiarius, with his net and trident. The secutor, with heavy armor and a short sword. The myrmidon, with his fish-shaped helmet and broad shield. Each had its own strengths, weaknesses, and choreography. And yes, it was choreography. The fights were real. Blades were sharp. Blood was shed. But they were also designed to entertain. Nobody wanted to watch two men awkwardly circle each other for 20 minutes. They wanted spectacle. So gladiator training was as much about performance as survival. You learned how to take hits dramatically, how to make the fight exciting, how to prolong it without dying too quickly. Think of it as a deadly mix between UFC and professional wrestling. The pain was real. The showmanship was too. Of course, punishment was part of daily life as well. Gladiators who disobeyed faced flogging, chains, or worse. Escape attempts were dealt with harshly. Remember, these men were investments. A runaway gladiator meant lost profits for the lanista. So security was tight. High walls, armed guards, locked gates. If you signed up or got forced in, you weren't leaving casually. Still, not everything was miserable. Gladiators were valuable, and value had to be maintained. They got medical care that, for the ancient world, was surprisingly advanced. Bones were set, cuts were stitched. There are records of doctors specializing in gladiator wounds, which, when you think about it, makes sense. If your whole clientele spends their lives getting sliced up, you get good at patching holes. And then there was the social life. Inside the barracks, gladiators formed bonds. They trained together, ate together, slept in rows of bunk-style quarters. Rivalries existed, sure, but so did friendships. Imagine the camaraderie of a sports team mixed with the dread of possibly being forced to kill your best friend next Saturday. A strange, tense mix of loyalty and looming doom. And yes, gladiators had fans, big fans, women in particular. Roman writers never shut up about it. They described noble women sneaking into gladiator schools at night, bribing guards, and trying to hook up with their favorite fighters. The emperor's own family wasn't immune. Emperor Commodus's sister, Lucilla, was rumored to have a thing for gladiators, which scandalized the Senate. But honestly, if your options were uptight Roman senators, or a tanned, muscular man with scars and a six-pack, well, let's just say the senators didn't stand much chance. Of course, not everyone admired gladiators. Roman elites often looked down on them, considering them filthy, dishonorable, and socially disgraceful. But that only seemed to make them more appealing to the general public. Nothing draws fans like a little social taboo. It's the same logic that makes people obsessed with celebrities who have messy personal lives. The disapproval only fuels the obsession. Now, here's one of the quieter ironies. Gladiators were treated better in training than many slaves working in fields or mines, because those workers were disposable. Gladiators were not. It was cheaper to keep them alive and healthy, to patch them up and feed them beans, than to replace them constantly. So in a strange, grim way, being a gladiator might actually give you better food, better medical care, and more recognition than being an anonymous slave in the countryside. It came at the cost of constant danger. But for some, that was still a step up. And let's not forget the atmosphere of the Ludus itself. The largest training school, the Ludus Magnus, sat right next to the Colosseum in Rome. Gladiators could look out from their barracks and see the arena looming nearby, a constant reminder of where their training would lead. excavations show underground tunnels connecting the school to the Colosseum. On fight days, gladiators would march through those tunnels straight into the arena, emerging like living sacrifices. Imagine spending months training with the sound of crowds echoing just next door, knowing you'd soon be walking that tunnel yourself. Sleep-inducing, maybe not. Anxiety-inducing, definitely. Still, not everything in gladiator life was grim anticipation. There was routine, repetition, the dull rhythm of training. Days spent eating porridge, swinging wooden swords, bandaging cuts, listening to old veterans tell exaggerated war stories. The monotony probably lulled men into a strange acceptance until the next fight came and the cycle began again. So what does all this tell us? The gladiator school wasn't a place of constant bloodshed. It was a machine, a carefully managed system to produce men who could fight, entertain, and survive long enough to fight again. It was structured, regimented, and at times surprisingly humane, though never for the gladiator's sake, only for the sake of profit. Alright, let's take a slow breath here. We've drifted through the daily grind of the ludus, beans, vinegar tonics, wooden swords, forbidden romances, and long tunnels to the Colosseum. Not exactly glamorous, but deeply human. Next, we'll float into the arena itself. The games, the noise, the animals, the blood. What it was like to step into that sand for the first time. The types of matches, the role of exotic beasts, and the sheer extravagance of Rome's obsession with spectacle. Because if the ludus was the rehearsal, the Colosseum was the final performance. And Rome never did anything halfway. Alright, now we get to the part everyone thinks about when they hear gladiator. The Colosseum, the roar of the crowd, the sand-stained red, the sheer spectacle of it all. But let's be honest, it wasn't always glorious. Often it was chaotic, smelly, and frankly, kind of uncomfortable for everyone involved. First, the arena itself. The Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheatre, if you want the official Roman name, could hold up to 50,000 people, which is a lot. Enough that if you try to imagine everyone there at once, it feels a bit like being squashed into a stadium during a sold-out soccer final. Heat, noise, dust, and the occasional smell of animal dung wafting from the lower levels. Comfort was not a priority, and the sand, it wasn't just for decoration. The arena floor was covered in a layer of sand called arena, designed to absorb blood and prevent slipping. The Romans were practical in their own grim way. They also made sure the sand could be replaced and sometimes even dampened to keep the dust down. Imagine being a gladiator, sweating in the midday sun and trying not to trip on gritty, sticky sand while thousands of people scream at you. Sleepy yet? Probably not. But let's drift along anyway. Now, the types of games. Most people think it was just man versus man. And yes, that happened a lot. But the Romans liked variety. There were beast hunts, venationes, where exotic animals from across the empire were brought to the arena. Lions, tigers, leopards, elephants, crocodiles, all imported to Rome like some bizarre wildlife delivery service. Gladiators would either fight the animals directly or orchestrate staged hunts to entertain the crowd. Not all gladiators did this, but the ones who did probably regretted signing that contract on a regular basis. Sometimes, the arena was even flooded for staged naval battles called naumachia. The Romans were nothing if not dramatic. They'd fill the Colosseum with water, float small ships, and have combatants reenact famous sea battles, which sounds amazing in a modern theme park sense. But for the poor participants, It was just wet, dangerous, and exhausting. And yes, some people drowned. Not ideal, but the audience loved it. Then there were the actual gladiator fights. Matches varied widely. Some were one-on-one duels, carefully balanced so neither fighter would die too quickly. Others were chaotic free-for-alls, with dozens of combatants wielding different weapons. The variety kept the spectators engaged. Roman audiences could be surprisingly picky. They wanted drama, tension, and yes, a little blood. But they also appreciated skill. A beautifully executed maneuver could earn cheers, even if the fighter was ultimately defeated. And remember the referees. They were real people called summarudis, often armed with sticks or whips, ensuring the match followed the rules. Not that there were many. The rules were simple: fight, entertain, survive if possible. If a gladiator cheated, tripped, or tried to run, the referee would intervene. Sometimes that meant a sharp warning. Sometimes, well, let's just say Rome didn't love rule breakers. The crowd had their say too. Romans were opinionated. They booed, cheered, and occasionally demanded death or mercy, which is where the emperor or sponsor would come in with the final decision. And no, thumbs up doesn't reliably mean spare him. Historians are still debating the gestures, but the general idea is clear. The crowd influenced decisions. Public opinion mattered, at least when thousands of eyes were watching. Gladiators were often matched carefully to make the fight interesting. The retiarius versus the secutor, for example. Lightly armored, agile, net and trident wielding versus heavily armored, sword and shield. The contrast was entertaining, like watching chess with swords, and the audience loved it. Betting was common, not legally regulated, and often quite intense. Romans bet everything from small coins to personal property, and the winners gloated while the losers learned the hard way to avoid the arena's influence. In addition to fighting each other, gladiators sometimes had to fight wild animals. This was the ultimate show of bravery, or more realistically, desperation. Lions and tigers were unpredictable, and unlike a trained human opponent, they didn't follow choreography. Gladiators had to rely on speed, skill, and luck, and often hope. The crowd went wild for a close call. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Fame and death were intertwined in the sand. Now let's talk a little about injuries. Cuts, broken bones, concussions, and puncture wounds were common. Gladiators learned to anticipate hits, deflect strikes, and fall convincingly without killing themselves. And yet, accidents happened. Sometimes a poorly timed swing, a misjudged step, or a slippery patch of sand could end a career abruptly. And not in a retirement way. Death was a constant possibility, even for the most skilled fighter. Despite the danger, successful gladiators became celebrities. They could attract wealth, attention, and sometimes even marriage prospects. Their popularity transcended class boundaries. Even noble women swooned. And while legally they were still considered infames, socially they held a strange kind of power. People admired skill, courage, and charisma. A champion gladiator could influence public opinion, and occasionally politics. But let's not forget the darker side. Losing meant humiliation, injury, or death. Even if spared, defeat carried social and financial consequences. Gladiators often lived in fear of the next match. Fame was a fragile thing, easily undone by a careless mistake in the sand. And the psychological toll? Well, let's just say chronic stress wasn't recognized in Rome. Gladiators endured it silently or complained in graffiti that survives to this day. Speaking of graffiti, arena graffiti is fascinating. Fighters sometimes carved their names, victories, or complaints into walls, immortalizing themselves. Even centuries later, archaeologists can read scrawled taunts, boasts, and humorous observations. It humanizes them. They weren't just muscle and scars. They had thoughts, jokes, fears, and rivalries. Even in death, they left traces of personality behind the sand. So when you imagine the Colosseum, don't just picture gladiators as murderous warriors. Think of them as performers in a deadly theater, skilled, disciplined, human, and often terrified. They trained, ate, slept, bled, and performed for thousands of spectators who oscillated between admiration and cruelty. Their lives were long stretches of monotony, punctuated by moments of extreme danger. The arena was only the most visible part of their existence, but it defined their legacy. All right, let's pause for a moment and drift out of the sand. Picture the Colosseum emptying, the crowds leaving, the blood washing away, and the gladiators returning to their barracks. Some carried scars, some carried fame. Most carried memories of fights that would never be retold outside the arena. And yet for centuries, their stories would echo in Roman culture, literature, and even modern imagination. Next, we'll float into the human stories behind the names, famous gladiators, the improbable champions, and the tragic figures whose lives, though brief in the sand, left a surprisingly detailed record of resilience, fame, and human ambition. Because behind every sand-covered helmet, there was a person, a story, and sometimes a bizarre sense of humor. Hey guys, tonight we're going to float across the Atlantic, back to the late 16th century, to a small patch of the New World that became famous for being, well, missing. I'm talking about the lost Roanoke colony. So dim the lights, settle into something soft, maybe stretch your legs a bit, and let's drift into a story of slow mystery, mild mismanagement, and people quietly vanishing into history. The lost colony wasn't huge, about 115 settlers, men, women, and children, trying to carve out a life on a remote patch of what is now North Carolina. They landed in 1587, full of hope, determination, and possibly the wrong kind of optimism for the times. The English were trying to plant a foothold in the Americas, and this little colony was supposed to be their start. Instead, it became a puzzle for generations. Let's set the scene. Roanoke Island was, well, interesting. Beautiful coastline, abundant wildlife, but also isolated, swampy in parts, and not exactly a short walk from England. Supplies were limited. Communication was slow. Months at sea, depending on weather, pirates, or navigational errors. So the colony began life under a constant cloud of uncertainty. Life in the New World was never easy, but Roanoke settlers were about to discover a level of inconvenience that could lull anyone into slow existential panic. The leader of the colony was John White, a man whose ambitions were modest in theory, but immense in reality. He painted, he mapped, he tried to organize, he kept lists. He had been back to England for supplies soon after the colony's arrival. And here's the thing. He left with plans to return in a matter of months, but got delayed. Bad weather, political tension, and the usual 16th century sea chaos kept him away for 3 years. 3 long years. Meanwhile, the colony waited. They waited, they farmed, they built, and they probably started whispering, "So, is anyone coming back? Or are we just here?" When White finally returned in 1590, the settlement was empty. Completely. No people, no struggle signs, no hasty graves, no dramatic last stand. Just silence. Well, mostly silence. The only clue was a single word carved into a post. Croatoan. That's it. All caps, simple, and hauntingly vague. No exclamation points, no explanation. Just Croatoan. Now, Historians have debated that word endlessly. Some think it was a reference to a nearby island, Croatoan Island, modern-day Hatteras Island. Perhaps the settlers moved there, tried to integrate with local tribes, or simply fled the coast. Others theorized the word meant a specific group of people, a hint at survival elsewhere, or maybe a cryptic warning. Whatever it meant, it was tantalizingly unhelpful. The settlers had left one breadcrumb and vanished into history. Let's float over to daily life before the disappearance. The colony wasn't idle. They farmed corn, built homes, and tried to establish trade with local tribes. They weren't entirely naive. Relationships with Native Americans were complicated, but sometimes cooperative. There's evidence they exchanged goods, learned survival skills, and even adopted some local practices. Still, stress and scarcity loomed. Food shortages, illness, and isolation meant tension was constant. Humans under stress tend to fidget, argue, and make odd decisions. And that was true at Roanoke too. There's an interesting human detail here. The children. Some were born on the island. Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, had a daughter named Virginia, the first English child born in the New World. Imagine being a baby in 1587, knowing your parents were constantly worried about food, safety, and whether the sea would deliver supplies. Mildly stressful, but in a sleepy, quietly terrifying way. And adults? They had ambitions, complaints, fears. They quarreled over land plots, worked the fields, repaired structures, and speculated endlessly about the return of John White. No diaries survive from the colonists themselves, so we mostly know their thoughts through second-hand letters, maps, and the vague hints White left behind. But one can imagine long days of silent toil, interrupted by the occasional nervous glance toward the horizon, waiting for sails that never appeared. Disease probably played a role. The New World had its challenges: unfamiliar plants, insects, and infections. Smallpox, dysentery, and malnutrition would have been constant risks. Yet, interestingly, no mass graves were found at the site. This has fueled theories that the colony moved voluntarily, or at least tried to, rather than being wiped out in a single catastrophic event, which is less cinematic than zombies or massacres, but more plausible in a slow drift into history sort of way. Supplies were another slow-moving problem. Settlers relied heavily on shipments from England, which were irregular. 3 years without reliable reinforcements meant they either had to adapt or relocate. Some historians suggest they merged with local tribes, adopting survival strategies and living quietly out of colonial sight, which, when you think about it, is an oddly peaceful ending for a story so often imagined as tragic or violent. Now, human psychology during this time is fascinating. You're isolated, waiting years for help, facing unknowns every day. Some probably got restless. Some may have wanted to explore the coast or inland. Some may have mistrusted neighbors or local tribes. Fear and hope mingled slowly, subtly, producing quiet tension. No one left detailed accounts, but we can imagine whispered debates over firelight, quiet arguments about whether to wait or move, speculation about the Croatoan clue. Human nature hasn't changed much. Stress plus isolation equals slow, careful, sometimes irrational decision-making. And the sea, always the sea, calm one day, stormy the next, horizon distant and teasing. For 3 years, the settlers waited on its edges, hoping for John White, fearing it would never bring him. The Atlantic was a slow-moving antagonist, patient, indifferent, and vast. Ships could be delayed, wrecked, or redirected. Communication across thousands of miles was measured in months, not days. The ocean's slowness mirrored the colony's limbo. Waiting, surviving, adapting, and ultimately vanishing without a clear trace. So why do we still care about Roanoke? Because it's a puzzle that drifts in the mind like fog. No heroic deaths, no famous battles, no sudden apocalypses. Just people, quietly trying to exist, and then gone. It reminds us that history isn't always loud. Sometimes it's slow, subtle, and gently unsettling. Humanity leaves hints, carvings, maps, letters, and then fades, leaving future generations to drift through speculation and theory. And of course, the story has gained a mystique that outpaces reality. Ghost stories, legends, and a lingering sense of what if swirl around Roanoke. But the core truth is quieter. A small group of people, cut off from the world they knew, faced uncertainty, adapted as best they could, and ultimately disappeared into history's slow currents. Not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but hauntingly effective in a reflective, sleepy sort of way. Alright, let's pause here. Picture the island now. Quiet forests, gentle waves on the shore, an abandoned village slowly reclaimed by nature. Imagine a child's swing left in the sand, a door slightly ajar, the faint trace of human habitation fading into the soil. The colony is gone, the people are gone, and all that remains is a cryptic word, Croatoan. Drift with that image for a moment, slowly. Let your mind follow the tides, the wind through the trees, the subtle mystery lingering for centuries. In the next part, we'll float into theories, slow speculation, and archaeological attempts to trace where the settlers went, what they ate, how they might have survived, and why some clues remain maddeningly vague even today. Because history, like the tide, moves slowly, and Roanoke drifts along with it. Alright, so we left the colony abandoned, the word Croatoan carved into a post, and John White staring at empty homes like a man who just realized life sometimes forgets you exist. Now comes the fun part, speculating, which is basically the entire history of Roanoke. Let's float gently through the most prominent theories, the subtle evidence, and the quirks of human imagination that have kept this mystery alive for centuries. First, the friendly relocation theory. Some historians suggest that the colonists traveled to Croatoan Island, modern-day Hatteras, and integrated with local Native American tribes. This makes sense. The word carved into the post could have been a note to White saying, "We're alive, we're over here." It's plausible, because archaeological evidence hints at European-style artifacts in tribal settlements in the region. Coins, tools, beads, little breadcrumbs that suggest some level of integration. But let's slow down. Integration doesn't necessarily mean they thrived. Surviving in a new environment, relying on unfamiliar crops, and negotiating relationships with indigenous populations would have been slow, painstaking, and full of subtle challenges. Imagine trying to farm unfamiliar soil, fish in a rivers you don't know, and avoid accidental conflict while carrying a faint hope that supply ships might still arrive. Patience, quiet observation, and adaptability would have been essential. Stressful, but in that calm, drawn-out, sleep-inducing historical way. Another theory, less cheerful, more dramatic, is that the colonists tried to return inland or explore other regions, but gradually succumbed to disease, starvation, or hostile encounters. The evidence here is thin. No mass graves, no confirmed skeletal remains, just hints and speculation. It's plausible though. Survival rates in the 16th century New World were notoriously low. Food shortages, unfamiliar diseases and environmental hazards claimed lives slowly but steadily. The colonists might have simply vanished, leaving no trace besides whispers in history. A third theory is the Spanish attack scenario. Spain and England were rivals, and some have suggested that Spanish forces may have destroyed the colony to prevent an English foothold. There's little concrete evidence for this. No battle records, no burned settlements noted by Spanish explorers. But in a slow, subtle sense, it highlights the precariousness of life at the edges of empire. Colonists weren't just isolated from England, they were also vulnerable to global politics, which, in the 16th century, moved slowly but inexorably. And then there's the assimilation and cultural blending hypothesis, which overlaps with Croatoan integration. Some suggest that the settlers were gradually absorbed into multiple local tribes. Names appear in tribal oral histories. Oral tradition is tricky. It drifts, mutates, and stretches over generations. But it's fascinating to imagine. Descendants of the English colonists quietly living within indigenous communities, slowly becoming indistinguishable from their neighbors, their stories blending into the rhythm of everyday life. No mass tragedy, no dramatic apocalypse, just human adaptation at a languid pace. Food and survival strategies provide subtle clues too. The settlers likely farmed corn, fished, and gathered wild plants. They had European tools, but adapting these tools to a new environment would have required trial, error, and patience. Hunting unfamiliar animals, identifying safe plants, and avoiding illness from spoiled food. These were slow, careful processes. Mistakes could be fatal, but small successes meant survival. The colony may have endured quietly, in ways that never left a dramatic trace. And there's always the minor theory of relocation north to Chesapeake Bay. Some suggest that survivors traveled hundreds of miles along the coast. Plausible? Technically, yes. Likely? Debatable. Traveling long distances in the 16th century, overland or by small boats, is slow and arduous. Weather, navigation errors, and limited food would have made this journey a tense, drawn-out struggle. If some colonists made it, they likely became part of other settlements, their identities gradually merging with new communities. It's important to note that archaeology has tried to catch these whispers. Dig sites on Croatoan Island have revealed tantalizing hints. European-style houses, tools, and ornaments, but nothing definitive. And archaeologists have to be patient, because digging up centuries-old soil is a slow, meticulous process. Each layer tells a story, sometimes subtle, sometimes maddeningly vague. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as they say, especially when dealing with people who may have integrated quietly and left few dramatic traces. Human psychology also plays a subtle role in Roanoke speculation. People like mysteries. They fill gaps with stories, sometimes dramatic, sometimes mundane, but always compelling. The Lost Colony is perfect for imagination. It's neither fully tragic nor fully heroic. It's a gentle, unresolved puzzle, and the mystery persists centuries later because it's slow-moving, quiet, and endlessly interpretable. People can read, write, and argue about it at length, perfectly suited for calm, late-night reflection. Let's pause on the word Croatoan again. It's a single haunting breadcrumb, carved neatly, left without additional context. Some argue it was a tribal name, a destination, or a sign of survival. Others say it was a desperate signal, a quiet, almost polite message, like leaving a note under a neighbor's door. We're gone. Good luck. It's the slowest kind of clue, quietly suggesting human agency amidst absence. The word is a tether, and nothing else drifts along it. Another subtle element. Settlers' possessions. Tools, weapons, and personal items likely disappeared with them. Some may have been traded, some buried, some lost to the elements. Tracking such objects is painstaking work for archaeologists. Each fragment tells a whisper of human life, but rarely the full narrative. And the slow unraveling of material evidence mirrors the slow disappearance of the colony itself. Nothing dramatic, just pieces floating through time. Interactions with Native Americans are another quiet dimension. Some evidence suggests the colonists may have lived with local tribes, learning survival techniques, exchanging knowledge, and gradually blending cultures. No one knows exactly how extensive these interactions were. They were probably subtle, everyday negotiations, learning to fish, hunt, farm, and coexist. Daily life, quietly adapting, without fanfare. Not the Hollywood version of conflict or warfare, but a slower, human story of adaptation. And then there's John White's perspective. Imagine returning after 3 years, crossing the ocean, and finding your community vanished. It's subtle despair, not a cinematic horror, but a drawn-out, reflective kind of grief. White's maps and notes are meticulous. He tried to document what he saw, hoping for clues, and yet he found almost nothing. His experience mirrors the colony itself. Slow, patient effort, met with quiet uncertainty and enduring mystery. Finally, let's float over to the cultural impact. Roanoke became a symbol of early colonial ambition, human fragility, and the endurance of mystery. Writers, historians, and even pop culture have latched onto it. Ghost stories, novels, and documentaries all celebrate its ambiguity. And maybe that's the most lasting legacy. Roanoke didn't leave grand ruins, but it left a gentle, persistent question mark, quietly drifting through centuries, inviting speculation, imagination, and slow reflection. All right, pause and imagine it. Picture the island in 1590. A few remaining tools, half-built houses, the faint smell of salt and wood smoke, the distant sound of waves. No people in sight. A note on a post, carved neatly. Croatoan. Life paused, then drifted elsewhere. Humans adapted, dispersed, or vanished. The land reclaimed its space slowly. And history, patient, persistent, and unhurried, drifts through the centuries, leaving us to imagine what quietly happened in the spaces between those letters. In the next part, we'll drift into modern investigations, archaeological digs, forensic analysis, and ongoing efforts to trace the colony's fate. Because even centuries later, history moves slowly, quietly, and sometimes whispers answers we can almost hear if we're patient enough.